Professor Behnke is a full professor and head of the working group Public Administration, Public Policy at the Institute of Political Science of the Technical University Darmstadt. Her research is located at the intersection of public administration, comparative federalism, and multi-level governance. In research projects, she's investigated the role of senior civil servants in daily processes of negotiation and coordination between federal units, policies of accommodation in divided societies, the reform of fiscal federalism in Germany, dynamics of federal constitutional reforms, and the function of ethics measures in politics and administration. So please, Professor Behnke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be given the opportunity by the organizers of this webinar to share some thoughts with you on whether, and if so why, Germany can be regarded as a role model in the COVID-19 pandemic crisis management. My contribution is based on the assumption that the high policy implementation autonomy of Germany's sub-state units, the so-called Länder, is an essential factor in explaining this success story. Still, before I begin to talk to you about how German federalism is organized in everyday policy making and policy implementation, and how those structures and mechanisms worked in the crisis situation of pandemic management, let me state two caveats. The first caveat addresses the assumption that Germany performed unusually well during the crisis. I happily admit that during the first wave, say between March and July 2020, we experienced no breakdown of our health system. The steep increase of daily new infections was curbed within 4 weeks, and most notably, we have an unusually low number of fatalities per capita. Still, as we all know, the crisis is not over. We currently observe a renewed increase of daily new infections. Many speak of the second wave, and we still have to stand the test how we will contain the spread of the virus under conditions of cold weather, regular work, school, and everyday social life. So let's keep fingers crossed, but not be overly enthusiastic. The second caveat addresses the assumption that German federalism, and more specifically the autonomy of the Länder, was essential in successfully fighting the pandemic. Empirically, we only have a co-occurrence. Germany is a federal country, and Germany fared comparatively well in crisis management. I will supply you with several plausible considerations why this co-occurrence might indeed be causally related. But we have no chance to test this empirically, as we do not know how Germany would have fared without its federal structure. In the next couple of minutes, I will first give you a short insight into how everyday policymaking is coordinated in Germany between the federal level and the Länder. I go on to describe how those structures and processes which are ingrained in the German federal culture worked during the crisis. And I will conclude by sharing with you some ideas why this coordinated system of decision-making and implementation might indeed be better equipped to manage a pandemic crisis than a centralist system. Among comparative federalism scholars, Germany is typically regarded as an ideal typical case of cooperative federalism. As a matter of fact, for decades, if not centuries, our institutional setup and tradition of cooperative culture encourage intense coordination between levels and units of government. Generally, the vertical relationship between the federal government and the Länder governments is perceived as constructive. Federal encroachment is mostly not a pressing issue. The division of labor between levels of government is marked by a functional division of powers. Legislation occurs predominantly at federal level. There, the Bundesrat, the second Länder chamber, has a strong position. In matters of direct concern to the Länder, federal bills require a positive majority of Bundesrat votes. Thus, the Länder can strongly influence federal legislation and request, if necessary, for example, federal co-financing in the implementation of laws. On the other hand, the Länder are mainly responsible for implementing laws. In practice, they often delegate this task to the local authorities. Healthcare, specifically, is mainly in the jurisdiction of the Länder. Public health offices are organized at district level and financially and personally dependent on local governments. The Länder coordinate their interest in legislation and their practice and implementation in voluntary horizontal intergovernmental councils. The heads of government meet in the Minister Presidents Conference. Furthermore, sectoral policies are organized in 18 sectoral councils, among which, for example, the Health Ministers' Conference. Those councils serve to informally coordinate agenda setting as well as policy-making processes, horizontally, but also vertically. That means the federal representatives are mostly invited or included in those council meetings. Those meetings, as well as informal contacts between Länder governments, are the most important and powerful instruments of policy coordination. During the pandemic crisis, the Minister Presidents Conference met on a much tighter time frame than usually. Usually it meets 4 times a year, among which twice with the Chancellor. Since March, they met in a rough 2 to 3 weeks rhythm as video conference, where the next steps were negotiated among the Länder heads of governments and the Chancellor. Those video conferences served to tightly coordinate Länder actions in accordance with the new information they received concurrently from experts, e.g. the Robert Koch Institute or medical experts counseling the Chancellor. This way, individual steps by Länder governments were extremely rare, as an analysis of executive orders that I conducted in the past weeks reveals. In addition to this coordination with intergovernmental councils, task forces within Länder governments, mostly in government chancelleries, coordinate policy implementation in really every direction with ministries, Länder offices, public, the press, and also with other Länder and the federal level. Finally, the public health offices played an elevated role in crisis management. Being under the authority of districts, they act in a highly decentralized manner, and this decentralized action was attributed by many to the quick reaction to the crisis, e.g. in terms of providing protective gear and in testing and tracing contacts. What we could observe during crisis management was thus a highly decentralized action in the individual Länder, but simultaneously most intense coordination among all actors involved. And I believe this is indeed the best way to react in a crisis situation which is marked by high complexity and uncertainty. Literature on crisis management stresses the importance of retrieving a maximum of information available, to include expert knowledge, and to act in a piecemeal manner so as to minimize the damage caused by errors. When 17 heads of government and their staff continuously exchange information, discuss and negotiate the best steps to be taken, this increases the rationality of decision-making. If we compare this kind of German decision-making with the US, for example, we clearly see that a federal government that encroaches into decision-making of its sub-state units can do great damage to the crisis management. It is important to cooperate and to listen to each other instead of working against each other and trying to impose centralized measures. What is more, if coordinated decision-making is paired with decentralized action, it is possible to experiment with minor variation on regulations and observe which work better or worse. Finally, decentralized implementation allows Länder governments to adapt their measures to regional variation in problem pressure and administrative capacities. Those few considerations highlight the advantage of a federal architecture which combines coordinated decision with decentralized action. One might argue that decentralized action in infection prevention is possible also in a system with a decentralized administration without having necessarily political federalism. Still, it is in particular the political negotiations among many autonomous governments which, although it may take longer to arrive at a decision, contribute to taking ultimately more efficient and rational decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Behnke. I will now go ahead and open the floor for discussion, and we have some questions from the audience. So the first question we have here, it says, in countries or regions where government financial support for people who have lost employment due to COVID has been adopted, Was it a federal government responsibility policy or a subnational one?
I think this is a very good question, because we cannot talk about policies and federalism if we do not talk about money. And so I can just contribute from the German experience, and I am convinced that in part, in terms of the way we managed the crisis in terms of quality of life or economic development, indeed we were fortunate that we have a well-developed welfare state, and the money that was paid for the people was in part paid by the federal government and in part by the sub-state governments. There's one instrument, I think this is really a German brand. In German we call it Kurzarbeitergeld, which means money for people who reduce the weekly workload. So the firms pay only, say, 30% of the salary, and the people work only 30% of the salary, and the rest of the 70% is paid by the government, or sometimes it's a bit less, it's maybe 50% or something like that. So this instrument was very useful in reducing the risk of unemployment in the wake of the pandemic, and it has been prolonged in Germany, and this is something that is being paid by the federal government. But we also have kind of immediate relief money that is being paid for people who work, who are not employed but who work on their own devices. So they have small businesses or small service delivery jobs, and they got a small amount of money on a very informal way, and this money they received from the subnational government. So it was both, basically.
Thank you, Professor Behnke. Sure.
No, just to add to what everyone else has said, in Canada, we've actually seen all three levels of government play according to their responsibilities and fiscal abilities. You've had the federal government, which has provided income support. You've had the provincial government, which has played in providing support to small businesses on rent subsidies. And you've even had local governments play a very important role in doing things like deferring property taxes. To me, the bigger question in all of this is, what happens in the future? One of the things that the lockdowns did, I think, across the world over the last 6 months has really devastated the fiscal capacity and resource-raising capacities of municipalities and provincial/state governments. And so, really, the only level of government that has the ability now to raise finances are national governments or federal governments around the world. And as we go into the next phase, where local bodies or subnational entities become more important in the implementation of policies, whether it's screening, lockdowns, reconstruction, I think what we have to think about is how the relationship between the various orders of governments are worked out in order to find the most efficient way of delivering what essentially are going to be, for a while, national or federal funds to meet the needs of local communities.
Thank you so much. If there's a question, I'll go ahead and move to the next one. Another member of the audience is actually asking, due to the financial debts generated by the pandemic, not evenly distributed among federal and subnational governments, can we foresee institutional changes to be adopted to address this imbalance?
Yeah, I've been thinking on what Mr. Chattopadhyay was saying. I think this is a really complicated situation. Basically, in federal systems, I think we can distinguish three types of how federal finances are organized. One possibility is that the subnational units receive grants, mostly conditional or sometimes unconditional grants from federal government. The second option is that we have separate taxes, so the subnational units have their own taxes, tax levying, tax varying powers, and the federal government has its own taxes. Or we have a system like we have it in Germany of joint taxes, of shared taxes. if I think of those three scenarios, I would expect that in a system where the subnational units mainly depend on federal grants, in the wake of the pandemic, there's a situation vis-a-vis the federal government will be rather weak, because they have no negotiation power. In the case of separate taxes, it is a bit the same, because the tax revenues will be considerably lower due to the economic crisis. And I think that the strongest situation is for subnational units in a system of shared taxes, because the way taxes are distributed between levels of government is itself a matter of negotiation with a strong negotiation power of subnational units. So the question from the participants was, what is the expectation? How will the institutions change? And I would wish that more systems would have subnational units give them a say in how taxes are distributed, so to strengthen their power. But I would expect the opposite, that the vertical fiscal imbalance will get greater, so that the federal government will get stronger in matters of fiscal distribution, and the subnational units will become ever more dependent on grants from the federal government.
Thank you, Professor Behnke. We'll move to the next one. This is our last question. Somebody from the audience is asking, what are the main challenges that have been identified in coordinating an effective response to the crisis, best practices and lessons learned? Professor Behnke?
Yes, thank you very much. I didn't mention this before, but federalism typically interacts with party politics. And in Germany, we witnessed this tension, so to say, that from the point of view of the interests as a subnational unit, there was a strong spirit of coordination and of cooperation. So people really talked to each other and they negotiated joint solutions, and then every sub-state unit would go on to issue its own executive orders, but they were really very similar, and in many instances they were issued the very same day. For example, in terms of lockdown of schools and universities, it was the same day from the northern to the southern part of Germany. So this worked pretty well. But as I said, we also have party politics. So the heads of government and the individual sub-state units have their own interests in terms of running for campaigns. And we could very well observe that specifically those heads of government who had ambitions as running for example, for the next term of German Chancellor, they really stepped out of this coordinated line and tried to gain profile by doing things on their own. So there's always a challenge if you have a federal system with relatively high autonomy of sub-state units, how to contain those interactions between a kind of federal competition and a kind of party political competition.
Thank you, Professor Behnke.